This is my visual aid. It's an illustration from The Ugly Duckling by Hans Christian Andersen with a quote underneath. These are my speaking cards. I have 3 audience members today. 3.5. This is Sean. This is Maeve. This is Celie. This is Michael. And there's Percy. All right. So the author Maria Popova has credited Albert Einstein as saying, if you want your children to be intelligent, read them fairy tales. If you want them to be very intelligent, read them more fairy tales. So while Albert Einstein may never have said those exact words, the sentiment behind the words is still true. There's a reason that fairy tales stick with us through our life, since we're children through adulthood. Little Red Riding Hood teaches us not to speak to strangers. The Ugly Duckling teaches us not to judge by appearances. The Emperor's New Clothes judges us not to rule by mob mentality. As adults, we want our rom-coms to end in a great big blowout wedding between the prince and Cinderella prototype. Fairy tales prep us for the pitfalls of life. They teach us valuable skills and lessons. Fairy tales, in short, are relevant no matter what age you are. I spent the majority of my youth reading fairy tales. I was obsessed with them when I was younger. I would illustrate them and I would write my own based on the proper fairy tale prototype. I have a BA in English with a minor in education. I've studied story structure and educational theories. I've even written papers on the importance of fairy tales and the importance of reading fairy tales to children. My aim then today is to persuade you that reading fairy tales to children will aid in their development of academic skills, foster their emotional development, and will teach them long-lasting, essential life lessons. My first point, the aid in development of academic skills. Fairy tales teach us critical thinking skills right from the youngest age. They teach us right from wrong, and they teach us the consequences of our choices. Discussing a character's choice is a whole lot safer for a child than to talk about your own choices. Learning about right versus wrong when it's not directly bothering you is a lot easier for a child when they can't think in abstract ways. Fairy tales build vocabulary, and they introduce us to culturally rich language. We learn words and terms that are not commonly used anymore. Popova notes in her essay, Einstein on Fairy Tales and Education, that there is a 400-word vocabulary difference between the strongest and weakest reader in a kindergarten class. Fairy tales build good vocabulary. They give us an entire story structure. It includes plot, setting, characters, climax, and resolution, all in a relatively short story. In her essay, The Defense of Fairy Tales, Maria Rodal describes that many stories lack a strong story structure. Many children's stories lack a strong story structure. Fairy tales provide knowledge of how a story flows and works. Now that we've talked about the academic development, I'm going to talk about emotional development. Author Sheila Kohler says in her article, The Importance of Fairy Tales, that the positive effect has been proven by child psychologists who have studied this topic in depth. Child psychologists know that fairy tales provide many functions for children, for their inner emotional worlds. Children dream in magic and wishes. They also have deep anxieties, such as separation and disappointment, and fairy tales touch on all of these very important childhood aspects. Fairy tales teach us problem-solving skills and emotional resilience, most importantly. Jack Zipes describes in his book, Why Fairy Tales Stick, the Evolution and Relevance of a Genre, that fairy tales filled with characters make poor choices, and children learn through these characters how to make better decisions. Children learn that bad things happen to everyone, no matter what you do, but within a safe and distant world. Fairy tales are helpful because children can't think abstractly, and that detachment from the real world lessens the scariness factor. Fairy tales teach certain emotional conflicts with others that are universal, and they are shared. Children share their innermost fears, and they're externalized into forms of a scary witch, a big bad wolf, or a destructive giant. They can put their fears into those characters. Marina Warner, in her book From Beast to Blonde, on fairy tales and their tellers, says that characters in fairy tales represent deep feelings that children have. Children are better able to understand and process these feelings, and kids deal with tough emotions by projecting their own violent feelings onto these evil characters, while they relate, in turn, to the main characters, who are often children themselves. And these children are plucky, and they usually triumph over the evil adults. My final point to cover today is that fairy tales teach us enduring life lessons. They teach us about life, and they give key imaginary experiences that shape us throughout our lives. Noted child psychologist Sally Goddard Blythe describes in her book, The Natural Child, that it is very clear to children that fairy tales are not in the real world, that children may be unfamiliar with these characters, but not with their feelings and their problems. Fairy tales give children a way to understand confusing and difficult feelings that children can't naturally articulate. The stories are safely set apart from them in a simplistic good versus bad world. This black and white nature of fairy tales help children feel comfortable, and it's a perfect environment for learning important life lessons such as good behavior and morality. Fairy tales are a safe place to explore that life isn't always easy. Sometimes things go wrong, and people don't always have the best interest at heart. These quote-unquote good characters are rewarded often at the end of the story. This reinforces the positive importance of being kind and thoughtful and true. This is my visual aid today. This is a more specific lesson from a fairy tale. So Hans Christian Andersen's The Ugly Duckling is about a duck who doesn't fit in. He's not the same as the other ducks. So the other ducks pick on him and bully him. Kids recognize this feeling. They understand it and they feel it. They feel it in many situations, whether it's the first day of school or whether they're trying something new for the very first time that they're afraid of. Kids learn to empathize, and through this story they learn to empathize in the importance of being kind. The duckling eventually turns into a beautiful swan. This teaches children not to judge by outward appearances, and it teaches how we can change or evolve in life. Original fairy tales often had scary, violent images and situations. Parents are often uncomfortable with the content. G.K. Chesterton once said that fairy tales don't tell children that dragons exist. Children already know that dragons exist. Fairy tales tell children that dragons can be killed. Parents should not fear the raw power of fairy tales. J.R.R. Tolkien understood that fairy tales were to be a realization of imagined wonderland of children. They have the power to tell the psychological truth about growing up and how to be a good person and how to develop a sense of moral responsibility. Fairy tales are inherently written as a learning tool. You can learn big emotions, story structure, and life lessons. Now, whether you're enjoying a fairy tale on the big screen in a dark theater, or whether you're in the dark forest of imagination, follow the breadcrumbs of truth with your child and enjoy the power of fairy